I got home late that night, later than usual. We'd gone to a party on campus, and I stayed a little longer than planned, talking to some people I had just met. When I finally decided to head back, the clock had already passed 2 in the morning. The campus was eerily quiet, with the streetlights casting distorted shadows along the way. But I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to get to my dorm, throw myself on the bed, and sleep. When I opened the door to the room, I was met with darkness. The only sound was my breathing and the zipper of my bag, which I carefully set down on the floor to avoid making too much noise. My roommate, Julia, seemed to already be asleep, lying on her side with the blanket pulled up to her shoulders. I almost felt guilty for coming in so late. She was always very organized with her schedule, unlike me. Without turning on the light to avoid disturbing her, I quickly changed and lay down on my bed. The silence was comforting after so many hours of loud music and conversations. But, at the same time, it felt a bit oppressive. The kind of silence that amplifies the sound of your own heartbeat, you know? I was almost asleep when I heard a strange noise. It was soft, but distinct, like something was dragging or lightly moving. I opened my eyes, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the room was too dark to see anything. I decided to ignore it. It was probably a noise from the hallway or the wind hitting the window. But the sound continued, a faint scratching, something muffled. This time it seemed to come from the closet, which was next to Julia's bed. I shifted in my bed, already feeling uneasy. Maybe Julia was messing with something in the closet. Perhaps she had woken up and was trying to grab something without making too much noise. But why wouldn't she turn on the light? "Julia?" I whispered. No response. Just complete silence. I tried to listen more carefully. It was the kind of sound you hear when someone is trying to move but is somehow restricted or limited. A soft rustling of fabric. "Julia?" I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. Only the scratching sound persisted, now more noticeable. A strange feeling began creeping down my spine. I sat up in bed and turned on my phone's flashlight, pointing the beam towards Julia's bed. My stomach tightened. The bed was empty. The blanket, which had seemed to cover her body, was just piled up, as if someone had thrown it there to make it look like someone was lying underneath. A wave of panic washed over me. I swallowed hard and turned toward the closet. The sound was still coming from there, more urgent, clearer now. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, though my hands were already trembling, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. With short steps, I approached the closet. The handle felt colder than usual when I touched it, my hands sweating and shaking. The door seemed incredibly heavy, but I knew I had to open it. When I pulled the closet door open, I saw something I will never forget. Julia was inside, tied up. Her wide, terrified eyes stared at me, and her mouth was gagged with a piece of black tape. Her arms and legs were bound with ropes, pressing her against the back of the closet like a discarded doll. My throat instantly went dry, and a silent scream got stuck inside me. And then, as if my body had acted on its own, I rushed to her. I removed the gag with trembling hands, my fingers almost failing as I struggled to untie the knots. Julia gasped for air, her eyes still filled with panic, but a single word escaped her lips, barely audible. "Him." I turned sharply to look at the bed. Someone had been there. Someone who was no longer. "Who? Who was it?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, but the fear was paralyzing me. Julia tried to speak, but she sobbed uncontrollably. I knew we needed to get out of there, but my legs felt glued to the floor. The idea that at some point, someone had been lying in that bed, pretending to be her, terrified me. The intruder was gone, but the fear that he was still somewhere close by was suffocating. I grabbed Julia's hand and pulled her out of the room. We ran down the dorm hallway, heading for the safety of the reception. I could barely think straight, but I knew we had to tell someone. Call security, do something. My thoughts were scattered, confused, but one thing was clear. Someone had been in our room, pretending to be my roommate while I was just a few feet away. When we finally reached the reception, a brief wave of relief washed over me. I quickly explained everything to the receptionist, who immediately called campus security. Julia was still too shaken to speak, clinging to me as if she expected the nightmare to continue at any moment. Security arrived quickly, and we were escorted back to the room. They searched the place, But whoever had been there was already gone. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing that could explain how he got in or out without me noticing. After a few hours, the police were called, and Julia was finally able to explain what had happened. She had returned to the room earlier that night, and before she could even react, she was attacked by a man who tied her up and locked her in the closet. He had been there when I entered, pretending to be her in bed. Despite all the searches and investigations, the man was never found. No clues, no trace. He simply disappeared as if he never existed. But he had been there. I knew he had. I heard him, and I still feel the chill of that moment every time I think about what could have happened if I had turned on the light sooner or taken longer to realize something was wrong. Life went back to normal, at least on the surface, but since that night, I've never been able to sleep soundly again. The silence is now a constant reminder that no matter how safe you think you are, someone, somewhere, might be watching. And the worst part is, they could be closer than you think. The night was eerily quiet. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a week of studying, or perhaps the absurd stillness of a university dorm during summer break. The campus was practically deserted, with all my classmates having left to enjoy the holidays. I, however, had to stay behind to study for a crucial exam. The fluorescent lights flickered lightly above me, something that had been irritating me for hours. The silence was broken only by the sound of the pages from a book I was distractedly reading. And then, the fire alarm went off. It was piercing, abruptly invading my thoughts, echoing through the empty hallways. I jumped from my chair, my heart racing. I thought it must have been a routine test, but at 3 a.m., that didn't make sense. I grabbed my phone and quickly got up, throwing a jacket over my pajamas. I ran down the stairs, following the flashing red lights indicating the emergency exit. When I reached the courtyard outside, I expected to see other students, or at least a security guard, someone responsible for deactivating the alarm. But there was no one. The campus was empty, and the alarm kept echoing through the metal structure of the building. I looked around, confused. The sound was deafening, and the absence of any human presence made it all seem surreal. I tried to open the door to go back inside the building, but it was locked. I pushed the cold metal harder, feeling panic start to rise inside me. The door was definitely locked from the inside. I looked through the windows, trying to figure out if it was some sort of misunderstanding, an error, or if someone had deliberately locked me outside. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe the alarm had triggered an automatic lock on the doors, and I just needed to wait for someone to show up and fix it. But as the alarm kept blaring, there was no sign of anyone. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The constant noise was starting to pound in my head, and the discomfort of being there alone was growing by the second. I decided to walk around the campus, hoping to find another way out, a security guard, anything. As I walked, I noticed something strange. I felt like I was being watched. Have you ever had that feeling? That shiver down your spine, the heat on the back of your neck, as if invisible eyes are fixed on you? I stopped, looked behind me, but there was no one. Just the wind blowing between the abandoned buildings. I kept walking, picking up the pace. The alarm was now distant, muffled by the building's walls, but my heart was beating faster than the noise. I passed by the library, the classrooms, and then by a small garden area. That's when I saw it. There, in the corner of the building, far off, something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a cat or some nocturnal creature. But then, I saw a silhouette. A person. I froze for a second. Who would be out here at this hour? I called out, but there was no response. Just the slow movement, as if the person was hiding. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a janitor, or someone who had also gotten locked out. I tried to approach, but as I took a few steps towards them, the figure disappeared behind one of the buildings. The uneasiness in my chest grew stronger. I went back to the courtyard and tried the door again, but nothing. Locked, just like before. The feeling of being watched returned, more intense. I looked around and there it was again, at the end of the hallway leading to another building. The same silhouette, motionless, now clearly watching me. And this time, closer. I swallowed hard. Something was off. I decided to get out of there and find help, But as I walked towards the main campus exit, the street lights started flickering, one after the other, until they all went out completely. I was surrounded by darkness. With tense muscles and sweat dripping down my forehead, I started running. I don't know what made me run. Maybe survival instinct, maybe the fear of being completely vulnerable. But with each step, I felt like the figure was getting closer. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the empty campus. It was like being in a dark, silent maze, with the only company being the distant blare of the alarm and the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. I found a side entrance to one of the academic buildings, and luckily, the door was open. I went inside, locking it behind me. The silence inside wrapped around me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I climbed the stairs, trying to find a safe place to wait until morning. My phone had no signal, and even if I tried, I didn't know who I would call. I sat in a corner, trying to steady my breathing. Time passed slowly, and every little noise, something falling, the distant creak of doors, made me jump. And then I heard footsteps. Not mine. The sound was slow and steady, echoing down the hallway. Someone was there, and this time I was sure. I closed my eyes, hoping they would pass, that it was just a trick of my exhausted mind. But the footsteps stopped right in front of me. I opened my eyes and saw the shadow through the glass door. The silhouette was there, motionless, just watching. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. There was nowhere to go, nothing I could do. My legs trembled, my heart pounded, and suddenly, the alarm stopped. Silence. The figure took a step forward and began to open the door. Then the beam of a flashlight blinded me. A security guard had finally arrived. The silhouette disappeared in an instant. I looked around, confused, dazed, trying to explain what had happened. But when the guard checked the area, there was no sign of anyone. I was escorted back to the dorm, and the alarm was written off as a technical error. But I never got an explanation for what happened that night. And to this day, I wonder, who was there? Was it a cruel prank, or something far more sinister? I never found out the answer, but one thing is certain. Since that night, I've never stayed alone on campus again. Renting that apartment seemed like the perfect solution to all my problems. I was tired of the campus dorms, always noisy, full of people coming and going, with no privacy. When I saw the listing for a small apartment just a few blocks from the university, I didn't think twice. The rent was slightly above my budget, but it was exactly what I needed. A place of my own. As soon as I walked in for the first time, I felt relieved. The place was modest but cozy. It had the essentials: a living room, a small bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom. There was only one thing that bothered me from the start, though. A locked door that the landlord assured me was just an unused storage room. He mentioned in passing that it wasn't worth messing with. "It's full of old junk," he said, almost casually. At first, I didn't think much of it. I just wanted the peace the place promised. The first few weeks were quiet. I'd come back from class, study, and sometimes have a friend or two over, but nothing major. I was happy to have my own space, and that locked door quickly became part of the scenery, something I simply ignored. But, like many things we try not to pay attention to, it began to bother me. It was hard to explain. At night, when the apartment was quiet, I would hear noises, small sounds, almost like footsteps, but muffled. Sometimes it sounded like something being dragged. At first, I blamed the neighbors. Old buildings always have their quirks, I figured. Maybe it was the pipes or the plumbing. However, the noises were different. They always seemed to come from the direction of that locked door. I began to notice little details that, together, started making me uneasy. At first, it was a chair in the living room that seemed slightly out of place. Then, the rug near the storage door seemed crooked, like someone had moved it. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had moved things myself and forgotten. After all, who hasn't overlooked some small detail in their daily routine? But as the days passed, the noises behind the door grew louder. What had once been faint whispers of sound turned into soft knocks, as if someone, or something, was actively moving around inside. The idea that the door held only junk seemed more and more ridiculous. The quiet of the night amplified every sound. I began losing sleep, lying in bed with my heart pounding, convinced that whatever was behind that door, it wasn't just the wind or the building settling. One night, I was startled awake by the clear sound of something being dragged behind the door. It was as if something was trying to get out. I sat up in bed, breathless, my heart racing. I sat there in complete silence, trying to hear more. And then I heard it. A soft but unmistakable sound of breathing. Someone was there. The next day, I decided to confront the landlord. I called him and tried to be polite but firm, asking him to open the locked door. He seemed uncomfortable on the phone but stuck to his story. There's nothing in there worth seeing, just old things from the previous owner. But I've been hearing noises, I insisted, trying to sound braver than I felt. Things moving. That can't be normal. He laughed, but it felt forced. It's an old building. They make strange sounds. Don't worry, you're safe. I hung up, but my unease only grew. Something wasn't right, and I knew the only way to shake that feeling was to find out what was behind that door. One afternoon, after classes, I decided I had waited long enough. I grabbed a crowbar from the building's garage and went back to the apartment. If the landlord wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. With trembling hands, I positioned the tool at the lock. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I worked to pry the door open. When it finally gave way, the creaking of the hinges was almost deafening in the apartment's silence. The smell that came out was the first sign something was wrong, damp and musty, but there was something else. Metallic? My stomach turned. I turned on my phone's flashlight and pointed it inside. The storage room was small and narrow, with shelves filled with old boxes, but what caught my attention was a mattress on the floor. Dirty and crumpled, like someone had been sleeping there recently. My heart nearly stopped when I realized there were personal belongings scattered around. Clothes carelessly thrown about, empty cans of food. It wasn't junk. It was a hideout. Someone had been living there. My blood ran cold as I realized that all this time someone had been in the apartment, just a few feet from me, while I slept, studied, lived my life thinking I was alone. I ran out of the storage room, panic taking over. But as I backed away, a horrible detail made me freeze. The mattress was slightly indented, as if someone had just been lying there. Almost instinctively, I swung my phone's light toward the shadows in the dark room. A shadow moved, barely perceptible, but it was there. The front door creaked softly behind me. I turned in panic and ran, not looking back. I locked the apartment door and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, trying to process what I had just discovered. That night, I never went back. I moved out the next day, leaving all my belongings behind. I called the police, of course. When they finally investigated the apartment, their report confirmed my worst fear. There were clear signs that someone had been using the space behind the locked door as a temporary residence. Footprints, personal items, but there was no sign of the person. For days, I waited for news. Who were they? How long had they been there? But nothing concrete was found. Just one disturbing thing. In the following nights, other tenants started reporting strange sounds coming from the walls.